The city moved through winter as if wrapped in a gray shawl, its streets softened by a chilled mist that dulled each hard edge into something almost forgiving. Inside the buildings where secrets lived, the fluorescent lights hummed with a steady patience, and the carpets carried the worn print of hurried steps that no longer seemed to rush anywhere at all. The world of intelligence is a place of rooms within rooms, a maze of whisper and reply, a ritual conducted in the quiet tones of men and women who keep their fears folded inside their pockets like folded maps that they pray never to open. In that world, a faithful face is a cherished anchor, and a familiar laugh can smooth the air in a windowless office. Yet it is there that the most unsettling question lingers, the one that moves through the corridors like a patient draft that cannot be sealed for long. How do you recognize the moment when trust becomes a costume and a friend becomes a door left ajar for an enemy to enter without making a sound? He arrived not as a sensation but as a reliable hand, a young man with a calm manner who remembered names and filed papers with meticulous care. Aldrich Ames began his life in intelligence in the kind of office that smells faintly of paper and coffee, where the rhythm of staplers and typewriter keys set a comfortable metronome for ambition and duty. He learned the patient work of reading what others missed and listening for meaning where there seemed to be none. He watched men who had grown gray in service carry themselves with the quiet authority that comes from knowing things that cannot be confessed, and he felt the allure of a life measured by what was withheld rather than what could be declared. The truth of a person often hides behind ordinary details. He wore clothes that did not ask to be noticed and spoke in a voice that smoothed through conversation without snagging on anything sharp. He loved the logic of the work. In those early years he saw himself as one more faithful instrument in the orchestra, content to play his part as perfectly as possible, convinced that the music they played together kept a fragile world from slipping into chaos. He studied the rival service that faced them across oceans and borders, learned its habits and cautions, admired the clean lines of it even as he dedicated his nights to finding the fracture lines that could be pulled open. Colleagues liked him because he did not demand to be liked. He was attentive without flattery, confident without bravado. He stayed late. He carried files without complaint. When the older hands told stories about stations far from home, he listened with the patience of a man who would rather swallow a picture whole than interrupt for understanding that might arrive too quickly. He learned to meet silence with silence, and in this he learned the first great truth of the profession that had chosen him. The stories that matter most are the ones told only inside the mind. He moved up the way a dependable man moves in a famously careful place. He did not astonish anyone. He simply endured and excelled through time. When he went overseas, he discovered the loneliness that can settle in a hotel room after midnight when your job is to look at crowds and imagine that every 10th person carries a secret that has your name on it. He learned to drink because so many others did, and because it softened the corners of nights that stretched too long. He learned to hide disappointment inside the easy joke that makes colleagues feel at home with you. He learned that intelligence work is not a romance of trench coats and lamps that do not quite work, but a discipline of repetition in which a single misstep can echo through years. The more he learned, the more he noticed how deeply the work depends upon patterns of trust. He moved between rooms where people assumed that shared language proved shared loyalty, and he found comfort in the rituals of secure meetings and coded communication. The enemy always had a face that belonged to someone far away. The enemy never stood at the coffee machine while you waited for a fresh pot and spoke about the weather without any real meaning. In that world, certainty comes not from dramatic revelation, but from the steady accumulation of small confirmations that nobody thinks to question because everyone wants to believe that their colleagues are made of the same material as themselves. The path from devotion to betrayal rarely announces itself with a flourish. It begins in small discomforts that a man tells himself he will resolve soon. It begins with the kind of compromises that appear almost virtuous because they promise to protect the confidence that others already have in you. It begins with a debt that should not matter but somehow grows in the dark, and a desire for a life that no longer seems to fit the shape that honest income allows. The expenses of a certain life crept in without malice. There was a house that felt like a declaration of success, polished and full of light. There was a car that seemed to answer the daydreams of a younger man who had once wanted to be noticed for something other than his safe reliability. There were dinners that tasted like a future he thought he deserved after so many years of unremarkable service. There was love that came wrapped in the sweetness of possibility and the allure of a new beginning, and with it came obligations that seemed manageable until they were not. The cost of appearances grows like ivy, patient and relentless, until it covers every brick and makes the building look beautiful to the passers-by even as it adds weight to the walls. He had always been good at explaining. He could explain a failed operation to a supervisor in a way that sounded like the necessary cost of doing difficult work. He could explain late reports with a smile and an apology that sounded sincere because it always was. When the money no longer added up, he found himself telling stories about inheritances and gifts, about a family that had been generous, about investments that had finally borne fruit. He told those stories because they were preferable to admitting that he had overreached. He told them because he believed he could align reality with the narrative soon enough. The small dishonesty would be temporary. The course correction would come. The pages of his life would reattach themselves and the book would again read as it should. Sustaining a lie requires a kind of creativity that can become intoxicating. He discovered the subtle thrill of passing as someone who had more than he actually possessed. He did not flaunt his comforts, yet he allowed them to be seen. He saw how easily people accept the pleasant illusion that a colleague is flourishing because life has been kind. He recognized that the attention of others does not naturally turn toward suspicion when the story they prefer to believe spares them the discomfort of doubting their own judgment. He quietly thanked the illusion many times because it allowed him to delay any reckoning that he did not want to face. Behind the smiles, the anxiety grew. The numbers did not remain obedient, and the purring of a car that had cost too much began to sound like an accusation delivered without words. His house felt like a stage in which the audience had decided to forgive the plot holes because the set design was so exquisite. He understood that he had entered a contest with reality, and that reality is a brutal competitor that always remembers the score. In that understanding, a seed of treason found fertile soil. It did not burst into bloom. It simply waited, and it waited in a man whose skills had always been the patient cultivation of things that nobody else could see. There is a particular silence that accompanies a decision when a person knows that he has crossed an inner line, a silence that feels like the moment before a storm breaks over a harbor, while the boats still rest on the water with a trust that they have not yet understood is misplaced. The act itself can be shockingly simple. A door is opened. A greeting is extended. Eyes meet. Words are offered in the careful order that signals a proposition rather than a trap. He chose daylight because daylight is a uniform that makes a dangerous action look like an errand. He walked across familiar ground toward the place where his rivals kept their instruments ready for men who might be willing to trade their faith for relief. He carried himself as a man who believes that good fortune is not an accident, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed every line in the play he is about to perform. The terms were spoken without theatrics. He could give them the names that mattered. He could tell them which doors to open and which to ignore. He could map for them the hidden tunnels that ran beneath the ground on which his own colleagues walked each day with the proud belief that the labyrinth belonged to them and them alone. The first payment felt like an unexpected warm rain that erases the dust from a city that had felt weary for too long. Relief flooded his shoulders, and the tension that had lived in his neck for months finally loosened its grip. He told himself that this would be the last arrangement he ever needed. He told himself that the information he had shared would be compensated for by new operations that would inevitably replace what he had compromised. He told himself that the people who might be endangered were already running risks that they had agreed to run. Those are the sentences a conscience uses when it is desperate to rewrite itself. He did not yet understand the force he had set in motion. On distant streets where nobody knew his name, men began to watch their backs with a different kind of caution. Codes that once looked familiar began to make the hearts of honest agents beat a little faster because they sensed the possibility of a shadow they could not identify. In stark rooms where lamps shone on faces that had stayed faithful to their promises, the unthinkable appeared in the eyes of interrogators who could not explain how such precise knowledge had arrived on their side of the table. It is one thing to imagine the abstract consequences of betrayal. It is another to feel the cold fact of it pressed against your skin by strangers who now know far too much about you. The decisions that he took in rooms that felt pleasantly anonymous rippled outward with a merciless arithmetic. A list written here became a pair of handcuffs far away. A whispered description carried across a table became a closed door that would never open again for the person whose character had once been described as worthy of trust. He was not reckless. He did not scatter secrets like coins. He cultivated a relationship that pleased both sides, and the bags that returned to him contained the sort of cash that announced itself with the quiet authority of permanence. The pleasures that followed were as modest or as lavish as he wanted them to be. He preferred a style that looked respectable rather than obscene, because the game he was now playing would not tolerate the resentment that envy awakens in colleagues who begin to wonder how a salary can support a life that looks increasingly radiant. He justified his progress with arguments that sounded convincing because they had been rehearsed so often. He had a wife who required certain comforts. He had earned the right to live without the anxiety that had gnawed at him. He worked in a profession that rarely rewarded honesty with wealth and that routinely expected sacrifice without offering the sorts of honor that make sacrifice feel sweet. He told himself that nobody would be permanently harmed because the balance of power between services is constantly shifting and no single agent can control the tides. In those assurances he found the lullaby that finally allowed him to sleep at night. He did not realize that the people most in danger are not the ones who know they should stay awake, but the ones who have convinced themselves that their dreams are a safe place. Betrayal often moves within an organization like a fever that the patient refuses to acknowledge. Meetings continued. Coffee poured into cups with a reassuring smell that seemed to promise that nothing had fundamentally changed. Reports were written in the same careful prose. People spoke about schedules and budgets and long-term plans with the comfortable assumption that the ground beneath their feet was still solid. Yet the signs appeared if one knew how to read them. Operations that should have danced through enemy defenses began to stumble and stop. Sources who had been reliable suddenly darkened like lights in a hallway when a storm cuts the power. Inside the rooms where analysis was supposed to make sense of confusion, people argued with each other in voices that tried to stay calm. Was the rival service simply better now, or had there been some catastrophic leak inside the house they had always believed was secure? When good men argued with each other, they did not immediately suspect that the enemy had been invited in. They preferred to think that their own plans needed improvement. They wanted the problem to be theirs to solve, because admitting anything else would require them to question the foundation of their trust, and that is a kind of pain that institutions resist with all their strength. He continued to deliver. In quiet ways that felt almost domestic, he passed along the kinds of details that make the difference between a guess and a strategy. When he sat at his desk in the morning and greeted the people who worked around him, he did so with a pleasant expression that did not waver. When he attended staff meetings, his notes were neat. When he met friends for dinner, his conversation was agreeably ordinary. He became an expert in the art of blending. He did not need to dazzle. He needed only to avoid attracting the sort of attention that decides to look again a second time. The damage continued to accumulate, and with it the sense that something unknown had entered the bloodstream of the service he had once served. Rumors traveled between desks like the wind that moves the blinds on an otherwise still afternoon. People began to mention names that had gone silent. They wore black in quiet rooms. They visited spouses and parents with flowers and apologies and the ritual language that tries to cushion the blow of the truth that sometimes never arrives. In the middle of the night, a few devoted souls stared at maps that were meant to comfort them with clarity, and felt only how small their own efforts had become in a game whose rules had been rewritten by someone who still smiled at them every morning. He learned to manage fear with the same skill that had made him a reliable colleague. He told himself that what had been done could not be undone, and that the only intelligent choice was to keep moving forward with the plan he had grown so accustomed to executing with precision. He reminded himself that both sides accept losses as the price of the work. He told himself that he had become a professional performing a job for which he was well compensated. He created a version of himself that could live inside the contradiction without going mad. He had help in this because money has its own anesthesia. It muffles conscience the way snow muffles the sound of footfalls in a city that has never expected silence. He aged noticeably slower than the people around him because his lies protected him from the portion of grief that honest people are required to carry. Yet privately he knew that anxiety had found a home in his stomach. The smallest change in routine made him tense. A glance that lingered too long in the hallway caused his pulse to climb a few notches above the pace that healthy men prefer. He began to watch the watchers. He measured the length of their stares. He calculated how often certain colleagues visited him and how often they kept their distance. He was too intelligent to assume that his luck would stretch to infinity. He pressurized his life into compartments and prayed that the compartments would hold. If you're still watching, please subscribe so that more people can discover these powerful true stories. The machinery of discovery does not always announce itself with flashing lights and triumphant music. Sometimes it begins with a spreadsheet and a person who believes that numbers will always confess under patient interrogation. The men and women who gathered in a shared effort to understand why operations were collapsing did not rely on intuition alone. They collected bank records and compared them with the salary that a person in his position could reasonably expect to earn. They counted cars and counted renovations. They noticed that certain bills had been paid with a cheerful punctuality that would have impressed any lender, and they wondered how that cheerfulness had been funded. Investigators are guardians of unsentimental arithmetic. They tracked deposits that did not originate from sources they recognized. They examined travel patterns. They met in small rooms and wrote on whiteboards. They listened to recordings made in the back seats of cars that had been temporarily borrowed with the knowledge of a judge who understood the gravity of what was being tested. They followed in the unobtrusive way that professionals learn only after many years of being confused by talent that tries to shape change into routine. He felt the brush of attention the way a horse feels a ridge under its hooves in a familiar field. It was not yet enough to panic him, but it reminded him that he was not in complete control. He reminded himself that he had survived this long because he maintained habits that others considered normal. He continued to rise at reasonable hours and to arrive at work with the rest of the men who wore similar ties. He took lunches that lasted precisely the length of a lunch. He walked to his car with a briefcase that nobody would have looked at twice in a parking lot under bright lights. He maintained the camouflage of the ordinary, and he trusted it because it had always been enough. He did not fully understand the stubbornness of the people who pursued him. They were driven not by hatred of him personally, because most of them did not yet know his name as more than one among many, but by a devotion to restoring a sense of order that had been broken by someone who had used their discipline as a weapon against them. They inspected wastebaskets and lifted the lids of mailboxes. They took long walks through neighborhoods that would have felt pleasantly anonymous to anyone who did not yet know what was at stake. They practiced the patience that is often mistaken for hesitation. They repeated small acts so often that the repetition itself became a source of meaning. In time they saw signatures that did not live on paper. They saw the rhythm of a man who moved toward a meeting that never occurred in a room. They traced the geometry of his habits and began to recognize certain angles as markers of something intentional. They watched the way he paused at certain corners and how he changed lanes with an alertness that far exceeded the demands of traffic. They gathered around a table and compared notes until a shape emerged. It was not yet a face, but it was certainly human. He sensed the heat and tried to breathe inside it. He tightened procedures. He demanded less from his friends across the city who paid him in polite currency because he feared that the appetite that had once driven him could now become evidence in the hands of adversaries who were learning to look exactly where they needed to look. He came home earlier in the evening and poured a drink with the steady hands of a man who refuses to tremble in front of his own reflection. He told himself that the odds still favored him. Then he lay awake at night and listened to a clock that had never sounded so loud. The morning of reckoning often resembles any other morning. There is coffee that grows cold because the plan of the day interrupts the pleasure of drinking it. The key slides into the lock with a familiar click that promises nothing in particular. You pick up a briefcase that carries the same weight as always. You sit in a car that has never betrayed you, and you trust the way the engine responds to your gentlest touch. The sky wears its usual color, and the radio plays a familiar song that makes the drive stretch out in a comfortable length. If the heart beats a little faster, the mind supplies 100 reasons that have nothing to do with fate finally crossing the street to meet you. The investigators positioned themselves the way hunters do who have studied the paths of their prey for so long that the woods begin to feel like a book they helped to write. They did not crave drama. They craved clarity. They surrounded without making the circle feel small. They waited for the moment when the ordinary routine would deliver the man they sought into the hands of the law that had been patiently gathering itself for a very long time. They stepped forward with a practiced courtesy that has no interest in cruelty because it does not need cruelty to feel powerful. When they approached his car, they read an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite resignation. It was the weary look of a man who understands that certainty has finally arrived and that all the improvisations of the past few years have run out of space. He spoke with politeness that he did not have to invent. He produced the few sentences that a man offers when he understands that the rest of the speaking will be done by others for a very long time. He looked at the faces around him and recognized in them the outfitted patience of people who knew exactly how far they had come and how near they now stood to the truth they had been building brick by brick. At headquarters, the questions were asked in a steady tone because the answers mattered more than the drama. He recounted events with the precision of a man who has long kept ledgers in his head. He made choices in those hours that he understood would shape the rest of his life and the lives of those closest to him. He carried out one final calculation that would protect someone he loved by absorbing the weight of guilt that others might have liked to distribute more generously. The reasons he gave for his betrayal sounded to the listeners like the reasons that so many men give when they have chosen themselves over the collective effort that once defined their pride. Money had played its part, and frustration had played its part, and the trick of convincing oneself that no lasting harm would be done had played a very large part. The case moved forward with a speed that shocked the public only because the public had not been invited to observe the months and years of preparation that made the speed possible. The papers carried a story that tasted both bitter and familiar. Another trusted servant of the nation had chosen a different master and had hidden that choice inside a life that wore the uniform of loyalty to work every day. The headlines wrote his name as if it were a diagnosis. The analysts went on television and explained how the betrayal had been accomplished with the help of weaknesses that few institutions ever wage war against with sufficient seriousness. Drinks were poured in living rooms where people who had never met him told each other that they had always suspected that a system built by human beings would always be vulnerable to the kind of human being who refuses to be satisfied with what has been honestly earned. Inside the quiet rooms where his colleagues gathered, there was grief, and there was a measure of relief. Grief because they finally saw the face that had watched them while they bled in the dark. Relief because the confusion had been replaced by a name and a story that could be told out loud with dates and details. They found themselves returning again and again to the same central pain. The enemy had not assaulted the gates. The enemy had joined them for coffee and had sat in the meetings where they had built their hopes. He had nodded when they spoke about the future with conviction, and then he had gone home and written the kind of messages that unmake futures without any pleasure at all. The story that followed was administratively clear and emotionally complicated. Sentences were pronounced. A woman who had shared his life carried a separate portion of the consequence that always arrives, because the justice system must account for the ways in which proximity can become complicity. He accepted terms that would keep him in a place where the walls do not forgive and time becomes a companion that does not forget your name. He read books and granted interviews and organized his memories into a shape that he could live with, because people cannot survive for long without a narrative that lets them see themselves as something more than their worst choices. Those who had chased him continued their work without celebration. The job does not permit much room for triumph. Even in victory there is the knowledge that the damage has already been counted in lives that cannot be restored to the world. The men and women who had carried out the investigation slept a little better for a few months, and then they returned to the rooms where silence makes a kind of music that you can only hear once you have learned to give up the craving for applause. They began again because there is always another pattern to study and another rumor that needs the weight of verification. Within the larger community that measures security for a living, the case became a text that everyone had to read. It taught lessons that seemed obvious only after the cost had been paid. Monitor the money that moves beyond what anyone can reasonably explain. Do not ask only whether a person believes in the mission, but also whether the texture of their daily life aligns with the salary they receive. Pay attention to appetites, because appetites will eventually ask to be fed, And not all diets accept the limits that honest employment insists upon. Watch for the small lies, because the small lie is a rehearsal for the larger performance. The public slowly folded the story into the larger stack of stories that form the national memory of disappointment and resilience. The headline that had once seemed to stretch across the entire sky shrank back into the column where older headlines go to sleep. The city returned to the rhythm that had been interrupted for a few weeks, and the winter that had ushered in the arrest gave way to spring that made the landmarks look softer and kinder once again. In neighborhoods where nobody thinks about espionage and betrayal unless a movie reminds them to, children rode bicycles and shouted small victories to each other under trees that had remained indifferent to the drama unfolding in offices where men and women plan the kinds of moves that reshape the world without ever appearing on a calendar. He settled into the routine that people discover even in places where freedom has been taken from them. He walked in circles. He wrote letters that folded themselves around explanations that had been said many times before. He answered a few politely worded messages from strangers who wanted to understand how a person who had once been described as dependable could perform the acrobatics of treason while still pretending to be a man who kept his promises. He struggled to give answers that satisfied anyone for long. Money is an explanation, but it is not a complete one. Fear is an explanation, but he rarely spoke about fear except in the quietest sentences. Pride is an explanation that people accept when they do not have the courage to talk about emptiness. That word never appeared in his public reflections, but the readers of those reflections sometimes wondered if emptiness had been the real author of his life during those years. The offices where he used to work learned how to rebuild trust the way a body learns to walk again after a terrible accident. The injured limb is stronger once it remembers how to hold weight, yet it never loses the memory of the fall. Checks that should always have existed were finally bolted into place. The culture shifted in small ways that only the insiders noticed. Supervision grew more alert to the dissonance between a person's story and the numbers that appear on a bank statement. Conversations became slightly less casual when the topic turned to vacations and houses and cars that can turn the head of a neighbor with the kind of admiration that sometimes hides a question. In a world where the appearance of loyalty is a currency that spends easily, the guardians of the institution moved carefully toward a posture in which verification would become as valued as confidence once had been. Around the edges of the case, the public noticed something else, something that mattered beyond the headlines. They noticed the endurance of human beings who continue to believe in the worth of their work even after the work has been used as a veil for a crime that feels personal to everyone who wears the same badge. Friends of the fallen spoke quietly about the people whose names would never be printed in the newspaper for noble reasons, but whose absence carved out an emptiness that cannot be filled by anything other than the recognition that some debts can only be paid by continuing the labor that was interrupted. The dignity of their persistence shone more brightly in the years after the arrest than it had before, because brightness always looks brightest against the shadow it resolves. The one who had betrayed them aged in a place where the seasons still changed and the sky still offered a range of colors at dawn that belongs to everyone no matter where they stand. He looked back on the years when he had worn the suit and the tie and the air of a man who knows what must be done, and he thought about the afternoons when he had walked into buildings carrying a secret under his arm that was heavier than any briefcase. He remembered names that were more than names. He remembered the thrill that had curled through him when the first stack of bills had passed into his hands and had given him the illusion that he had finally become a man who could live without the constraint that honor imposes on those who practice it. He remembered the quiet that had followed, the kind of quiet that grows inside a person who has discovered that appetite is a living thing that cannot be educated. It must be starved or fed, and once fed it cannot be appeased by promises to return to a simpler diet. Those who review history must decide what the story means beyond the details. Was it a tale of a single flawed man who chose himself over his fellows? Or was it a symptom of a broader failure within systems that expect too much for too long from people who are human? The question cannot be answered completely. A narrative that condemns only the individual feels clean and comforting, but it leaves untouched the environment that made the choice seem possible. A narrative that blames only the institution feels unjust to the many who gave their lives to a patient labor that deserves more respect than critics often grant it. Wisdom lives somewhere between those easy answers. In that space, men and women who take up the work in the years that follow learn to keep the lessons while continuing to believe that the labor is worth the sacrifice. At the end of all this, the reader is left with images that never quite fade. The clean corridors of a building where fluorescent lights mark the hours that have been sacrificed. A car rolling slowly toward an office under a gray sky, while a man grips a steering wheel and tries to slow his heartbeat with a series of slow breaths that no longer work. A folder laid open on a table while investigators trace the lines of a life with fingers that do not shake because shaking is not permitted. A woman standing in a kitchen in a house that once seemed like a promise, who looks out the window at a tree that has survived so many storms that it carries itself like a victory. A group of colleagues gathered at a bar where the beer tastes like memory and the talk holds no bitterness because bitterness is too heavy to carry home. The story of the spy within ends the way the best and worst stories end. It gives us the measure of the pain that human beings can cause when they decide that they deserve more than the truth will allow, and it sets before us the stubborn beauty of a group of people who chose to restore order without the ugliness of rage. They honored the past by refusing to despair in the present. They moved forward, and in moving they showed that a nation's strength is not the absence of betrayal in its history, but the character with which it recovers from the betrayals it could not prevent. When the city's winter finally loosened its grip, the lawns around the buildings where secrets are kept turned green again. The voices in the corridors sounded less strained. New recruits arrived with bright eyes and laughter that had not yet learned to quiet itself in the presence of years. There were still mornings when the memory of the spy within brushed against the mind like a cold wind that slips through the crack of a window that refuses to close completely. On those mornings, the people who had lived through the worst of it took a second to feel the chill, and then they picked up their files and walked toward their work. They did not pretend that nothing had happened. They simply chose to continue in the knowledge that value reveals itself most clearly in the shadow of loss. In the end, the story returns to where it began, to a question asked in the softest possible voice. How do you recognize the moment when trust becomes a costume? You do not always. Sometimes you only learn that it has happened after everything you believed has been rearranged by a hand you once shook with confidence. The answer is not a magic trick or a piece of technology or the discovery of a superior human sense that can smell treason the way a dog smells fear. The answer is the patient cultivation of cultures that prefer honesty to charm, verification to charisma, and the humbling acknowledgement that even the strongest walls must be inspected every day by people who remember what it costs when inspection feels like an insult rather than an act of love. The story closes on a face at a window where the reflection reveals both the past and the unpromised future. The person looking into that glass understands that the most dangerous enemy is not the rival service whose flag